Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Please call me Maz. It's a real honour to be here today and speak to you about a subject that's really near and dear to my heart. Except for the first time ever, I actually feel like I have to apologise for being a pilot. And now I feel like I have to apologise for being a physicist as well, after that last one. So you've heard a bit about my background. The main takeaway is that while I'm a pilot, I'm also at heart a STEM nerd. And I consider myself a scientist and an intellectual as much as I do a pilot, and I've tried to frame today's talk from both of those perspectives. Before we start, I'd like to dispel one major myth, and that's the myth of the sciences and the humanities standing in opposition to each other. I consider it to be a myth that's perpetrated by average practitioners of both. I'm a scientist by education. I'm an operator of complex technology by profession, but I'm a historian and a linguist and a philosopher by choice. And I recognise not just the limitation of cold technology, but the importance of the humanities throughout. So anything I say won't be at odds with that. You can see my scope slide. This is what we're going to talk about. Jacob mentioned STEM in the sort of narrow context of coding, and I'm hoping to give you a bit of a broader view of the big picture. So while STEM is an acronym that has entered common use, not everybody may be familiar with it. It stands for Science, Technology, Engineering and Mathematics, and they're ordered in an ear-pleasing acronym order, not in any kind of hierarchy, as there might be if we were looking at something like this. So breaking it down a little bit further, this is what STEM stands for, just as a starting point. So the natural physical sciences under science, technology, the cross-section of science and society, which delivers real products, engineering, technology, fairly well tied together, and mathematics all the way to the right of that cartoon, being the purest of the disciplines and the people that nobody can speak to. As I started researching for this talk, I initially felt quite silly because the premise of what I was going to talk about appeared to be quite self-evident. The major theme of the seminar is technology. So why do we have to make an argument about the value of technology-related education? So why do we have to talk about it? I've repurposed the historian's curse, which itself is a paraphrase of George Santayana's famous maxim. The historian's curse roughly says that those ignorant of history are doomed to repeat it, and those who study it are doomed to watch those who repeat it. And I think most of us would agree that this equally applies to anybody with a scientific education in today's world. I've certainly often felt that way when I've been subject to either unreasoned or unreasonable decisions made on dubious scientific grounds. The second point, and I know Winkelmann Haller knows this one well, the US had a big wake-up call when the USSR successfully launched Sputnik in 1957, and this drove, to that date, an unprecedented set of reforms in their science and technology sectors. These reforms were driven largely by fear, fear of losing primacy, but also a more existential fear. And some of the US-based papers that I've read in preparation for this talk ask, does the US need another Sputnik moment to regain momentum and change in the science and technology sectors? I venture that we shouldn't be waiting until we're driven by fear as a result of a pivotal moment before we start thinking about this, so that's why we're talking about it today. Then there are these two articles, and these two are just from the last week. From a quick scan of the literature, it appears that the only thing consistently growing in the STEM sector in Australia is concern about how to meet the challenge of the future with reducing interest. So the whole of Australian society is affected, and we should be talking about this as a society. The question for us is, how does the Air Force fit into the big picture, and do we specifically need to do anything about it? So I'm going to start with the first step of the scientific method itself, which is to formulate the question. And through the reading I did before coming here, I come across an assumption, which was almost an intuition, that STEM education may be useful in solving some of the problems. But the problems themselves were sometimes ill-defined and sometimes really not defined at all, including in our Air Force documentation. And the reason STEM is the answer, what's the question is in quotation marks, is because that was actually the title of a chapter in one of the books that I read. That's how ill-defined the problem has been. So I'm going to have a crack at it a couple of different ways. Firstly, much of the research by the civilian and government agencies into this issue start from the need to compete in a knowledge-based economy, which is directly based on the production, distribution and use of knowledge and information rather than the traditional means of production. So what we're talking about is a transition from the industrial to the information age. The same research identifies that this transition requires a new set of skills in the workforce. Or rather, it's not actually a new set of skills, it's just that the need for those skills has grown. So in the past, the need was restricted to the relative few that were employed in the STEM industries, whereas now the same skills are needed almost across the board. In other words, there are basically no unskilled occupations left. How does this apply to warfare? The knowledge-based economy has a corollary in knowledge-based warfare, which is a term I picked up from Secretary of Defence Strategic Studies Group paper from 1996, which talks about a great leap in warfighting from the industrial to the information age. So same words again. In addition, the paper recommended, and this is a direct quote, in addition to warfighting skills, we must teach them the impact of rapid advances in information technologies on warfare. And the recommendation was made for all soldiers, sailors, airmen and Marines. And again, it sounds very familiar, that broadening the need for the requisite skills. On the Air Force side, we're becoming thoroughly more technological, and it's a deep and profound change. But it's not limited to the toys. The whole point of both Air Force Strategy 2017 to 2027 and of Jericho is that it's not just about the toys. The change has to go several layers deeper. Systems in general are becoming more reliant on increasingly complex technology, meaning that our traditional way of understanding them, which is the Cartesian reductionist way of understanding systems, needs to morph into systems thinking, which is focused on examining the linkages and interactions of a whole rather than reducing it to constituent parts. As they get more complex, we end up in systems of systems territory. So rather than just thinking about the toys, the way we think about problems, and then second level, the way we think about thinking about problems has to change. So we've got same words, same skill sets, and the question is, how do we get the skills? One of the common answers is we get those skills through STEM education. And throughout research, the three main goals of STEM education coalesce, and that's a STEM literate society, or in our case, a workforce with 21st century skills, and we'll get into more of that in a second, and a deep pool of experts who can drive research and development and innovation. So from here on, I'll refer to these three as groups 1 through 3. Tom mentioned the word vocational. It's absolutely vital that we stop seeing STEM education as vocational only. Basically, the whole do engineering degree, be engineer recipe. And see it instead as a pathway to building essential skills applicable to a wide range of jobs. In other words, the primary purpose of STEM education may not be, and in a lot of cases should not be, exclusively mastery of subject matter in individual disciplines. It has to be broader than that. So let's talk briefly about Group 1, which is the STEM literacy piece. This particular definition of STEM literacy breaks it into 4 parts. I'm not going to read them for you, but broadly they are the ability to identify and solve problems using evidence-based approaches, broad awareness of STEM disciplines and broad awareness of how they interact with the world, and the willingness and ability to engage with STEM-related issues as a citizen. I'm sure we can all agree that these are worthy and important characteristics, especially in the day and age of anti-vaxxers and chemtrailers. And in terms of the RAF workforce, the first one there is probably the most important. So the ability to identify and solve problems using evidence-based approaches. Group 2 was all about 21st century employment skills, and here we start to cross out of the vocational side of STEM and into what we talked about in the question and answer session just before, and that's the, I think it was after Jacob's presentation, and that's the broader skill set that we should be aiming for. So in 2007, the National Academies in the US, so that's the National Academies of Science, Mathematics and Engineering, try to define the 21st century employment skill set, and they try to do it covering a large range of jobs, both in terms of skills and in terms of income. And regardless of how they looked at the data, how they grouped it and regrouped it, they came up with the same set. In effect, they came up with a minimal set, and what you see on the board is it. Notably, in 2014, our own chief scientist, at that point it was Professor Ian Chubb, commissioned a report by Deloitte Access Economics, trying to answer the same question, and they came up with pretty much the same set. Theirs was active learning, creative thinking, complex problem solving, and communication. So very, very similar set. On this list, at least these 4 are directly targeted, if not always delivered. I'll take Tom's point here, not always delivered by formal STEM education. And anyone who's been through the contact hours and the rigours of either a science or engineering degree will probably agree that the 5th one there is covered as well. So what does this mean for the Air Force? This is now the world according to Maz, right? Firstly, in an increasingly technological Air Force, we should aim at most of the workforce being in Group 1, which is that STEM literate group. I have an asterisk there because I actually think it should be all of the workforce, or we should be tending towards all of the workforce, but I try and stay away from absolute statements as a matter of prudence. Realistically, in an increasingly technological Air Force, we should actually be aiming for an increasing number of our workforce in Group 2, which is not just basically STEM literate, but in possession of that basic skill set that includes complex problem solving, complex communication, adaptive learning. In terms of innovation, so I'll talk about more about innovation on the next slide, but suffice to say, most of the continuous improvement style innovation that happens in the Air Force belongs and comes out of the Group 2 skills rather than the deep pool of experts, because it's a result of adaptive learning and problem solving. It's important, it's good work, but it's not really true innovation. We'll talk about that in a minute. Real technological disruption innovation of the sorts that Wing Commander Helen was talking about requires the deep pool of experts that come from Group 3. And the only point I'll make about that is that we shouldn't just be outsourcing that. That's something that as an organisation we should aim to be heavily involved in. A quick point on innovation. Innovation is obviously very important, and it will make or break our transition to becoming a 5th generation Air Force. However, I think the Air Force sets the bar on innovation far too low and calls simple common sense solutions and other changes, which are sometimes good and sometimes not, innovation. Wing Commander Helen actually spoke about the change fatigue that results from labelling everything innovation and striving for innovation's sake. A good example is the wearing of ice vests in the MEO to beat the heat. That's not innovation, particularly not if a FEG was doing it 10 years ago. That's just common sense. And if a FEG was doing it 10 years ago, it's actually a failure of communication and organisational learning. There are really good examples of real innovation driven by militaries. I've picked a couple that are close to my skill set. The first one up there is auto GCAS and auto ACAS, and take your point on acronyms, and I will expand. So autonomous ground collision avoidance and autonomous air collision avoidance, which are systems that will autonomously avoid aircraft and ground. Life-saving technology that's come out of the USAF plus industry partners, and it's causing massive changes in the way they operate aircraft. And while we can say that, yes, we don't have the resources of the USAF, and we don't, I agree with that, I've put another example up there, NIFTI, which is non-intrusive flight test instrumentation, which is an innovation that's come out of our Air Force plus local industry partners that is a thoroughly new solution to a thoroughly new problem, and the problem is the fact that you can't put flight test orange wire into a JSF, you can't crack it open, and it is a world leader, and Lockheed's very, very interested in it. So we can do it here, but we need to have a workforce that can think that way. So, the test pilot's favourite question, so what? What does this mean for the various parts of our workforce, and what do we do about it? And I note that what I'm about to present is not an exhaustive list because I only really have time to provide a few quick examples. So let's start with the technical workforce. The technical workforce has always been reliant on STEM education. We can talk about and we can discuss the importance of the quality of that education, the depth of it and the breadth of it. But the need for the education itself is fairly self-evident. So I'm not going to focus on that one, I'm going to move on to the others. Support functions. The support systems themselves are becoming a lot more technologically driven and fully integrated. And an example of that is ALICE, which is the Autonomic Logistics Information System that will be the support system for JSF. So in a way, the support workforce themselves need to become more technical too in order to understand the systems that they are being asked to use. The really interesting one about support though is optimisation. I venture that there would not be many logisticians in the Royal Australian Air Force who would say that our support systems are in any way optimised. I've spoken to a couple just to check. Optimisation theory is actually a branch of mathematics. It's one of my favourite branches of mathematics in my other nerd life. But it is also extensively operationally used by airlines. Most major airlines wouldn't be seen without their optimisation mathematicians because they save them billions of dollars. If an optimisation mathematician was to look at our support systems, I originally had this written as they would cry, and then I changed it to they would see a very interesting challenge. So what I'm proposing is not that we turn logisticians into optimisation mathematicians or vice versa. It's that we make the logisticians aware that this exists as a concept, as a tool, and that we make some of these people available in our organisation, although I'm sure some exist within DSTG. We just don't use them, we don't know to use them. And equally, to potentially drive the decision-making logisticians to actually use some of those tools when either changing or approving support systems. That drives me to the next point, which is one of my favourite points, and that's the decision-makers. And Tom said this morning something about not reining in senior officers, and I fear I'm about to tread into that territory. Perfect. While we have no need for decision makers to be experts, we desperately need them to be actually STEM literate. They're presented with buckets of information about technology, and sometimes it's no more than pure salesmanship. And we need them to make informed decisions, including when to call the experts and who to call. I have some horror stories from my own personal experience of decision makers asking for more pictures in a technical document, in a technical meeting about that document, or not being able to digest a very simple physics concept after it had been explained multiple times. And the 5th generation Air Force just can't afford that. Lastly, the operators, my kind. The argument is often made that we don't need operators to be able to build a system, just to use it, and that's valid. My question is, do we need to understand the system in order to use it? Maybe, maybe not, but I venture that we do need to understand it in order to actually exploit it to our best advantage, especially away from the guts of the envelope, the centre of the envelope. As systems become more complex and turn into systems of systems, the operators need to be capable of systems thinking and systems of systems thinking in order to remain relevant. And I'll give you 3 very quick examples. In the world of heavily automated aircraft, the old famous last words of "watch this" are no longer relevant, right? Now it's "what's it doing now?" And that was unexpected. I don't need the pilot to be able to code the automation system, but in order to fly that aircraft the way we want to fly it in the military, I need them to understand it and its modes intuitively, and that requires a degree of technological nous. Close to my maritime heart, an acoustician or a maritime tactical coordinator who understands oceanography and something like Snell's law and other basic physical concepts will not only be better at applying traditional sub-hunting tactics in different environments, but more capable of transitioning to the brave new world of multi-static, active, coherent prosecution, which is what's coming with PA. And here's the last one, which brings it all together. This is a PISA-best, or a specific access power diagram for a number of different fighters, including F-18 in yellow, F-16C in blue, and the MiG-29 in red. And here it is with the F-35 in black and the F-22 in blue superimposed. And don't worry, this is the unclassed version from my test pilot notes, so we're not breaking the rules here. Now, a small number of engineers and test pilots need to know how to make one of these. A fighter pilot doesn't need to know how to make it, but if they can read it, they can immediately see where they need to fight a potential adversary. Now, that may not be useful for a bog rat that's hanging onto the tailplane, but it's going to be very useful for a senior FCI who's charged with tactics development. A decision maker doesn't need to know how to make it and doesn't even need to know how to read it and understand it. But if I explain it to him, I need him to know how to understand it. And all of those 3 levels of skill come from the STEM toolbox. So let's finish up with the what now. Again, I caveat this, but this is not an exhaustive list because I certainly don't have all the answers. But the fact that we're talking about this here today is a good start. I'll start with a point that's not on the slide, and that's that the European Space Agency has recently, as in a couple of weeks ago, yet again extended an invitation to our government to join as a member state. That's the 4th invitation since 1977, and the first thing we should do is say yes. Because that will drive a whole lot of innovation and drive towards STEM education in the country. Back to the slide. We need to take advantage of the fact that other agencies, civilian and government agencies, are working on this problem and join in where appropriate. We can make local small-scale changes. I spoke about logistics and optimisation. So can we introduce the idea of optimisation mathematics and those specialists to logistics courses? I spoke to a friend of mine who's a loggy, and she told me that they're taught to seek efficiencies within the system, but they're never taught to question how to optimise the system. We need to invest in our workforce upskilling. And importantly, very importantly, we need to stop turning our own engineers into contract managers and outsourcing all the technical work, because the talent just follows it out of the Air Force. Sub-point there for the Williams Foundation to Mullen, a scholarship for a PhD in STEM. I don't know, might be an option. Now, I'm not a recruiter, but we do need to look at who we want and what skills we want and how to have them. And pretty much the only thing I can do in that field is the last point there, which is get the word out there. The nerds like me can have an awesome life of adventure and fly aeroplanes all over the world. And then to bastardise that immortal Field of Dreams quote, if we build it, they might come. I'll leave you with this point, which I'm not going to read to you, from our own chief scientist in 2013, which captures it nicely. And taking questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I will simply open the floor to questions. Thank you. One on the front row already.
Thanks, Matt. That was a fantastic paper. A confession, I have a science degree with honours too, so I am also a closet nerd as well as a historian. It struck me when you showed those 21st century employment attributes. If you'd put the word humanities there instead of STEM, I would have believed it, all of them, except maybe the self-motivation. And it did lead me to wonder how much you're actually talking about STEM education versus STEM literacy. It seems that a lot of what you're talking about there is about operationalising concepts, communication, and dynamic problem solving, which theoretically a humanities type education can also deliver, as long as you apply those skills rigorously to a particular set of concepts. I understand the difference between scientific thinking and humanities thinking intimately, but I just wonder, can you see some wiggle room there for more STEM literacy without necessarily a STEM education background?
Absolutely. And that's why I started with that caveat that there is no dichotomy here, right? But we tend to treat it. We tend to treat everything as your left or right, your humanities or your science, you're an operator or intellectual. And I think we fall down when we do that. I see no reason why somebody who has a humanities tertiary background, but who has done properly, high school maths and physics they should have the required level of STEM literacy to be a productive member of society. Unfortunately,
I'm bleeding.
and then you pay them for the pizza and ask them to leave your front doorstep. Yeah. Unfortunately, we have, I think as a society, we've gone such a long way to maintaining those dichotomies that you have people who have gone through their entire education and they haven't done maths since year 10. And not only that, but they have alienated themselves from any kind of scientific thinking because they've been told you're either one or the other. The number of workmates of mine that I hear say things like, I'm really bad at maths, I'm really bad at science, it's just so hard. The number of people I hear say that in front of their children is terrifying. Now, you can have a background in the humanities and be interested and receptive to scientific ideas, and you'll be one of the good decision makers. Conversely, like me, you can have a background in science and be receptive and interested in philosophy and history, and hopefully you'll be one of the good decision makers again. They're certainly not mutually exclusive. And that's why I think it's important to draw out those three different goals. One is just pure STEM literacy, which is really no more than high school level. We're not talking anything more than that. The second one is those 21st century skills, which again doesn't need to be tertiary. If you do high school properly, you should end up with it out of high school, as long as you then put some other education on top of it, that broadening, mind-broadening education. And it's only really group 3 that needs really serious STEM education. But the mandate here wasn't talk about STEM education at tertiary level or above. It was talk about STEM education as a requirement, be it at year 10, the coding that Jacob talked about, year 11, 12, undergraduate, postgraduate, etc. Does that answer your question?
Okay, we have 2 questions on this side, and then one at the back.
Thanks, Maz. Marco New Army Headquarters. First, thanks for the great burn, and also my future career path as pizza delivery boy. Use the big notes to do the change. Great presentation, but I'm struck by, and it's not unique to yours, that I've heard a lot about the enterprise outcomes of STEM for the Air Force. I wonder if you could relate this back to the purpose of the Air Force, or the value proposition of the Air Force compared to any other aeronautical agency we might have in Australia, and how it relates to the changing character of warfare. Because what I heard there was how we could get a better optimised Air Force. As a citizen, I'm wondering how, and it applies to the Army and the Navy as well, how does STEM make Australia better at warfighting, and what advantage, if any, can we leverage from it?
That's a fantastic question. Thank you, sir. The answer is actually, I could flip it back as another question. I'm not going to do that. But the answer to that question is basically the answer to why do we do any kind of education? Because I honestly don't think it matters that much what kind of education we do, as long as it's done properly. And that's why in a science degree you have to do humanities, general subjects, and hopefully still vice versa. It's been more than 10 years since I've been through uni, so I don't know anymore. Do you have to go through STEM education to be a contributor to what Air Force is intended to do and what it does? No. Does the nature of what the Air Force do and tries to do change through the application of STEM education as such? No. But it comes back down to those skills, which, as we've already discussed, are not necessarily unique to STEM education pathways, but I think we'll be hard-pressed to say that critical thinking, complex problem-solving, and complex communication, which happen to be some of the outcomes of STEM education, are not relevant to the purpose of the Air Force and what we're trying to capture and what we're trying to deliver. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
I'm as Chris McGuinness. I think I'm kind of following the last 2 questions. I tweeted earlier today after Sanu's presentation that technology is the mainstay of aviation, humans are the mainstay of war, and air power is kind of the intersection of those 2 things. And so I'm one of those humanities graduates that's kind of approached this from the other degree. I can read EM diagrams, or I used to be able to. So I think your message is it's a diversity of education. It is not a particular kind of education that matters. And I'm working in Plan Jericho right now, and I'll tell you that Jericho Project 16, which is education and training, is all about Group 2. It is not about building a better wrench turner or anything like that. It is all about adaptive thinking, complex, and quite frankly, it's a warfighting application of it, not an engineering application of it. I don't think those two are separate. I guess from a humanities point of view, the observation I would make is I hear many historically illiterate engineering and science types, as I'm sure you hear engineering and science illiterate historical types. So I guess the observation I would make, and this isn't a question actually, is it's the diversity of education, and I think you made an incredibly powerful case for that, more so than a STEM education as part of it. No question, sorry.
We have a question at the back.
Hi, ma'am. Jacob again. Just looking at raising the bar of education, especially with STEM. So year 10, science is generalised. Year 11 and 12, we specify it. And we want people to know those fields. So what might be some of the unintended consequences if we assume that we might be able to raise the bar from year 10 science to year 12, and we only accept ab initio trainings from year 12 onwards? So if we did that, right, and I know we're going to lose a lot of people at that year 10 level, but what other consequences could you see, me?
The consequences for Air Force or the
recruiting?
Consequences for whom?
Yeah, recruiting in general. So straight away, about half the applicants that we get coming in that are year 10, not year 12 qualified, would have to wait another 2 years, for instance. But, for instance, their mental resilience would be improved, we think.
I'm very loath to tread into water that I'm not comfortable swimming in, right? I have no background in recruiting or personnel management or personnel or any DP type stuff. But I did, one of the points I had on the last slide there was recruiting is both an art and a science. And it's always a trade-off. Like in aircraft design, it's always a trade-off. You want more power, you get more weight. We would actually have to look at what that trade-off is. I'm not necessarily saying that we need to raise the entry to any specific point, be it year 12 or undergraduate degree or whatever else. I'm more making a case for a consideration of what kind of education do our people need. It's actually quite aligned to the last presentation, which is what kind of education do we need in the future Air Force, and how is that related to training? I personally think that the majority of the issues we face because the Air Force is just a subset of society, and there are some profound issues with the Australian education system about how it approaches its outcomes. You know, it is largely considered and accepted as vocational only. We don't value broadening education like philosophy, which I personally value very highly, but as a society, we don't. So a bulk of the changes that need to happen in order to give us that 21st century workforce actually need to happen at the primary school level and the secondary school level and throughout the Australian universities. So I don't think I can meaningfully answer the question that is narrowed to what would happen if we just changed the entry standard from year 10 to year 12, because we're talking about a small perturbation in what is a vastly complex, chaotic system, let's face it. And I could give you a SAB, but I don't think it'd be particularly meaningful. And it's not unlike the idea that we could potentially make a second language compulsory for promotion to O4. Again, small perturbation in what is a chaotic system will give you a very interesting result down the track. And then you have to take into account all the different assumptions, such as the rate of uptake of second languages in Australia versus in the UK, etc. So the two questions are fairly related, and I honestly don't think I can give you Maz's stab in the dark, but I don't think that's overly meaningful, other than to say pretty much everything we've talked about today when it comes to education is an artefact of the Air Force being a subset of Australian society, which has some interesting ideas about what education is and how we should value it.
Thank you. I'm afraid we've run out of time.